Sunday, September the 28th. The key feature of this second Trump era is chaos, and some of it is a symptom of an impulsive and erratic leader, but some of it, much of it really, is highly strategic. Flooding the zone, creating a destabilizing environment could cause some of the administration's most dangerous moves to fall under the radar. So you probably heard on Thursday, probably as soon as it happened, that the Department of Justice indicted the former FBI director, James Comey, in what legal experts say appears to be an incredibly weak case. Just days after Donald Trump demanded Comey's prosecution in a public social media post directed at the Attorney General Pam Bondi. The indictment is a watershed moment in American history that spells out bad things for the rule of law in this country. But around the same time that the news of that indictment broke, something else happened. Something you might not have heard about, but is of monumental importance. Donald Trump signed a new National Security Presidential Memorandum number 7, NSPM 7 for short. Got it in my hand here. That could be the basis of the next phase of this administration's crackdown on political speech and dissent. The White House calls this memo, quote, countering domestic terrorism and organized political violence. It is a sweeping document, several pages long, that creates a framework that could allow the government to systematically dismantle political organizations that it deems to be a threat. The memo is overly broad. It opens up protest organizers, NGOs, and even private citizens to the possibility of being investigated for participating in political activity. The memo grants the Attorney General wide latitude to designate groups that could be deemed a domestic terrorist organization. It empowers several agencies, including the IRS and the Treasury Department, to investigate people affiliated with those groups, funders, donors, employees, tax-exempt groups, Americans living abroad who have so-called foreign ties. Organizing a protest could lead to you being investigated. So could donating to a political cause or simply working for a nonprofit. This memo is a big step toward criminalizing dissent and cracking down on ideology with which the administration does not agree. In justifying the need to take this action, the memo lists some recent examples of political violence, including, quote, riots in Los Angeles and Portland. So when the president announced yesterday that he's sending troops to, quote, war-ravaged Portland and authorizing full force, it's what this new memo he signed on Thursday was laying the groundwork for. During a press conference yesterday, local leaders, including Oregon's Governor Tina Kotek and Portland Mayor Keith Wilson, denounced Trump's directive and stood united in resisting the deployment of troops to their city, which has seen a decline in violent crime and homicide in recent years, according to FBI data. Here's how Portland Mayor Keith Wilson put it.
President Trump has directed all necessary in Oregon. The number of necessary troops is 0.
Politico suggests that Trump's fixation with Portland might have more to do with the protests against ICE that are currently taking place there. But Portland holds significant in Trumpian lore, as protests there over the killing of George Floyd took on an anti-government tone in 2020, and rioters set fire to government buildings. Even back then, you might remember, Trump controversially sent in federal troops that used controversial tactics. They transported arrested individuals in unmarked vehicles, and some unidentified officers wore camouflage in the streets, which has added to the tension in the city. And given that history, it's also worth noting that the new memo talks extensively of Antifa and anti-fascist movements, which are referred to in the memo as this anti-fascist lie. Because just days before the memo was released, Trump signed another executive order designating Antifa a domestic terrorist organization, which is particularly noteworthy because Antifa is not an organization at all. It is a decentralized, leaderless movement. Antifa doesn't have a press secretary you can call up for a comment or a website that you can go to. It's not an entity. It's loosely affiliated groups with similar but not necessarily identical ideologies. So the question now becomes, who will the government decide is part of Antifa? Joining me now is Timothy Snyder, professor of global affairs and public policy at the University of Toronto. He's a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences. He's the author of several books, including his latest on freedom. Tim, it's good to see you. Thank you for being with us. This memo that I'm talking about begins by listing recent examples of political violence: Charlie Kirk's assassination, the assassination attempts on Donald Trump's life, an attempt against the Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, the targeted shooting at an ICE facility in Dallas last week. It seems to be setting the groundwork for there's dissent, there's violence, and now the government requires more freedom to go against people who are dissenters.
This is where history really can help us a lot, because there are two elements to this that are incredibly familiar and which we have to recognize right away and call out. The first is the notion that anything that happens in the world is the result of some kind of conspiracy against those people in power. The whole theory of this memo is that there are vast, invisible conspiracies that are directed against the government, and then any data which comes up can be made to seem consistent with that idea. Of course, it's not actually true. And then the second part is that individuals have to be held responsible for the things that they do, whatever their beliefs are. In the system of the rule of law, we try, we investigate, we might prosecute on the basis of what individuals do. We can't imagine that everything is run by vast conspiracies. Once we accept the vast conspiracies, then we're accepting the theory of totalitarianism. And the third thing which is going on here is provocation. So this is a government which is deliberately doing things that it knows will generate a reaction. They're going to blame everyone. And it's very key in telling the story to recognize that it's the government that's responsible, that for the policies, for the provocations, and for the reactions. They should be held responsible for all of the chaos that they are bringing about.
Yeah, and one wonders, the reason I talked about Antifa is because Antifa is not really an organization, but this memo spends a lot of time on this concept. It reminds me, my family being from South Africa, it reminds me of the fact that they could round people up under the Suppression of Communism Act, right? And you didn't really have to prove anything. The suspicion was enough. This idea of attaching people and organizations to dissent and suspicious activity could be you or could be me at this point.
Yeah, and it's important to note that this is not a right or left thing. It's a totalitarian or not totalitarian thing. So the Soviet, I'll just give you another example. I'm just flipping the politics 180 degrees. In 1936, 37, 38, the Soviet Union based its own great terror in vast conspiracies which somehow couldn't be found. And that justifies investigating everybody. And the only way that those conspiracies come into existence is you have to interrogate very large numbers of people and then force them to confess to connections and institutions and so on that don't actually exist. So regardless of the politics, whether we're talking about anti-communism or Stalinism, the essential fact is a government which starts from the premise that there's a vast invisible conspiracy and therefore we can interrogate everybody is not a government which can govern according to the rule of law. It's an attempt to change the regime. And of course, by the way, it's all illegal, right? This is just a memorandum. We have to notice that these things can only be carried out according to law. And the law is 100% against the kind of things that Trump is saying that the government can do.
Say, because it's only a memorandum and probably doesn't meet the obligations required to become a law, and it's not passed by Congress, it would be thrown out. Except, Tim, that's not really an assumption we can make in our court system right now.
Yeah, but that partly depends on how we interpret it. I mean, you're right about the court. Right, this is not the court that one would want to have for this particular moment, but it's not our job to wait till things get up to the Supreme Court. It's our job to talk about these things and make clear how, on a very deep level, they're not just black letter law illegal. They're fundamentally against the notion of the rule of law. These are things that we have to explain and talk about, and then the suits have to be brought, right? Then the suits have to be brought. Civil suits have to be brought. When people's rights are violated on the basis of the nebulous notion of a conspiracy in this memo, people's civil rights are violated. So one has to conceptualize this, but one also has to go on the offense terms by which this will be litigated.
How do you clarify for people, because a lot of us don't think about either this in legal terms or in terms of history, attempts to attach individuals, or seems to be built to attach individuals to groups. You said earlier this week that, quote, undoes the basic tradition of liberty and law. Tell me what that means, because my viewers, I'm sure 100% of my viewers are going to say, I'm not a member of Antifa, I got no ties to Antifa, it's got nothing to do with me. Except this memo is trying to make ties between dissent and people.
Yeah, I mean, nobody's a member of Antifa because it doesn't exist as an institution or an organization. There's literally nobody in America who's walking around with an Antifa membership card because it doesn't exist in that sense. What they're doing tactically is they are just declaring into existence something that doesn't exist, and that non-existence gives them the broad latitude to investigate everything. That's the tactical magic of it, which we have to recognize. But in terms of the principle which you're asking about, the principle is this. All of the basic acts that establish this country assume that tyranny means the power of an unjustified individual over a group. And they all, starting from the Declaration through the Bill of Rights, all of it says that the way to counter that and to live lives of freedom proven guilty. That is the basic logic of our entire system. If you give that up, if you say, no, it's not individuals, it's specters, it's wraiths, it's non-existent groups that the government is allowed to take power. Premise of this memo goes against everything this country was founded on.
Tim, I'm going to ask you to stand by for a second. We're going to come back and continue this conversation with Professor Tim Snyder. You're watching Velshi on MSNBC. We're back with Tim Snyder, Professor of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. I've been looking since no chaos whatsoever. It's people enjoying themselves walking through the streets of Portland. You posted on within, thereby creating an atmosphere suitable for personal rule, is not only public. If you'd be excused as a regular person if you wondered why we're talking about Portland today, because there's nothing going on in Portland that justifies the imposition of ICE or federal troops in Portland.
There's nothing going on there at all, except that we have a government which is a provocation. And Portland is a normal American city. It has the problems that normal American cities have. The biggest problem that strikes me in Portland, address and solve. What you don't have in Portland is anything which would justify extraordinary military action. The point of the military action, though, is A, to set a precedent, to get us used to the idea something bad will happen. There's this whole passive-aggressive, provocative notion to all of this. They know that if they do this enough times, bad things will happen, and they will. And when they do happen, we have to hold the government responsible. The government is trying to generate friction and sparks so it can set a flame and then blame everybody else. But the government's responsible for all of this. Trump has to be held responsible for all.
In fact, in Chicago, the governor of Illinois made a point. Don't fall into the trap of the government. Whether this feels engineered, right? That Chicago didn't seem to work out for the government, although there was some ICE activity in it. But they understood that they were not going to get the provocation they were looking for. Is the idea that you go to a place of protest and anti-government protest and dissent a better spark?
Yeah, they're provocation shopping, right? I mean, they're going from city to city. Today it's Chicago, tomorrow it's after that it's Portland. And I agree with you. I think there's a logic to Portland. One is the tradition of protest. The other is that if you just go an hour or two east of Portland, you have plenty of people who have very different political views. So it's not hard to imagine something being set off by the provocative action of the federal government. The key thing is to recognize that whatever happens, whether it's nothing or whether it's a terrible conflagration, the responsibility is squarely at the door of the White House and nowhere.
In the Jim Comey news, it didn't get the sort of coverage it needed. It's written down and it's signed by the president. It is a memorandum, and then you got Donald Trump posting on social media to go after her political opponents. It's all of a sort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not wise, it's not all the way thought through, but it is real and it is threatening. The purpose of it, as we've talked about, is to undo the rule of law. What the people they'll go after de facto are Trump's personal enemies, but they will also go after groups who are engaged in precisely things like voters' rights, civil rights, democracy and the rule of law. That's what they will do. That's the model, right? That's the Russian model, the Hungarian model. Terroristic conspiracy who are interested in democracy. Us to respond to it.
What about the fact? I mean, look, we saw that people coming into the country can get their phones checked. We see that university students who have said things that the government doesn't align with are getting their visas revoked, or they're being snatched up on the streets. Does this feel like further encroachment? Does this feel like someone might have been dissent then is now something else today?
That is, look, that memo or no memo, that is certainly the intention and the fantasy. And that's, of course, the kind of thing which any tyrannical regime would like to be able to do, right? And so they put their fantasy down on paper. They've said, we would like to be able to say that anything that anybody does, that we can find a scrap of paper or a bit of audio recording about, we can connect anything to our theory that there is a vast left-wing conspiracy that is responsible for all the evil in the United States. That is their theory. They put it on paper. It's crazy, and it has to be named as such so that it doesn't become the basis for administrative actions. People inside and outside the government, judges, not judges, lawmakers, not lawmakers, recognize the absurdity of this, because if it becomes normal, then it might actually lead to action.
Professor Timothy Snyder, it is always good to talk to you. Thank you, sir. Timothy Snyder is a professor and the Temerity Chair of Modern European History at the University of Toronto.